also live from my page. It's so weird now, just like watching myself. Like, yeah.
We are live.
Okay, now we are live. You guys record mo dyan. Make sure it's recorded.
Yeah, it's recorded.
Okay. This is so weird. Just seeing myself.
Okay.
And sharing it to your page. Sharing to
So I think I need to share it to my. How do I do this? How do I share it sa ano ko?
Ako na. Ikaw na lang, be.
So I think I need to share it to my. How do I do this? How do I share it sa ano ko?
Ako na. Ikaw na lang, be.
Ako na lang. Share it to my. How do I do this? How do I share it sa ano ko?
Ako na. Ikaw na lang, be.
Ako na lang. Share it to my. How do I do this? How do I share it sa ano ko?
Ako na. Ikaw na lang, be.
Ako na lang. Ito lang parang nag-bounce. Nag-bounce.
You have to switch off your Facebook Live. Switch the volume, the audio of your Facebook.
The audio, how do you fix it?
I-X mo lang yung ano, i-X mo lang yung audio, yung mic, ano, speaker symbol.
Anybody with loudspeakers, please, if you can use an earphone, maybe.
Yeah.
It's just between me and ano muna. Me and Anurag.
Narag.
Mute mo na yun. Mute mo na yun.
So we will start in 2 minutes. So yeah, just relax and yeah, we'll proceed. So we will start in 2 minutes.
All right.
So yeah, just relax and yeah, we'll proceed. I- Iba mo na lang yan. Are you guys ready? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. I think we'll go na tayo dyan. Okay. Ready? Okay. So good afternoon or good evening to all of you, and thank you for joining us for our second live stream event for Rights Corridor. And for the next few weeks, we'll be looking at the effects of COVID-19 on migration. And we're quite really fortunate to have actually a fantastic speaker, Mr. Anurag Devkota. He is a human rights lawyer, and he specializes in the linkage between contemporary human rights issues and migration. And he's a lawyer at the Law and Policy Forums for Social Justice in Nepal. He holds a master's degree in law, LLM, from the Loyola University of Chicago as a Gates Scholar. And he's been litigating a lot of migrant worker cases at the Supreme Court of Nepal. And he's been regularly writing a lot of articles, op-ed, and policy papers for a number of international organizations. And he's also a faculty member teaching law at Purbanchal University, Chakravarti Habi Academy College of Law. So we're very pleased to have you, Anurag. And we also have my co-facilitator here, Mr. Anuj Tijwari, or Dr. Anuj Tijwari. He's a senior researcher at the Center for Research and Development at King's College. And he's also a faculty member in the Department of Conflict, Peace and Development Studies at Tribhuvan University in Nepal. He holds a doctorate degree in international relations from the University of Warsaw in Poland. And my name is Furlan. I'm the managing director for Rights Corridor. And the main objective of Rights Corridor is to democratize access to policy insights and perspectives related to migration governance in the Asia Gulf, Africa Gulf migration corridor. So for the next few weeks, we'll be looking at thematic issues related to sending countries various strategies, coping mechanisms, and challenges in dealing with migration governance issues in the Gulf region. So for this particular dialogue, we'll be highlighting 5 different aspects to this. So the first one is we'll look at the current scenario in the Gulf countries, and we'll directly link that in the context of Nepal, actually. And then from the current scenario, we'll link it directly with the current data. Where are the migrant workers from Nepal? Where do they work, etc. And then from data, we'll look at the current situation, then the government responses, and then the capacity issues. And then the last one is we'll look at the post-COVID. What does it look like in the context of Nepal, and various policy insights and recommendations that we hope will be very useful for the Nepali government. So let me start by setting the context for this dialogue. So at least you can directly ask Mr. Anurag about these 5 thematic issues that we prepared for him. So as you know, in the Middle East, the region has been impacted by COVID-19. And as a result, a lot of the major industries in the Gulf, hospitality, manufacturing, construction, domestic work, have been halted. And this created major labor market implications, specifically for migrant workers. And as you know, they constitute 29 million. It's roughly 51% of the total Gulf population. And as a result, a lot of the state revenues have been impacted, and state budgets have also been reduced, and a lot of these private sector jobs have often linked state revenue. So that really created a lot of unemployment problems, specifically for migrant workers. And now you see a massive surplus of unemployed migrant worker populations here. And I think a lot of these issues have produced a lot of domestic and foreign policy challenges for the host country, the Gulf, and migrant sending countries like Nepal. Now, current critical issues in the context of foreign policy revolve around repatriation, and it becomes a very deeply political and challenging phase for a lot of sending countries that have very low fiscal budgets. And so in the case of Nepal, high proportion of migrants abroad, roughly 5 million, could potentially lead to high risks, and high political pressure, administrative pressure, and diplomatic pressure as well for Nepal. Now, the question is that, I think the bigger question that we're trying to look at here is, how do smaller and to an extent weaker states manage migration crisis, given the prevailing power asymmetry in place in the Gulf countries? So let me just go into sort of the specific items that we prepared, these 5 thematic issues. So let me start by asking Mr. Anurag. So Anurag, could you tell us just very, very briefly the basic profile, demographic profile of Nepali migrant workers, including their sectoral concentration, skill levels, and geographic spread, globally, but more specifically in the context of the Gulf?
Thank you, Ferlin. Just wanted to make sure if can you all hear me?
You can, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you for providing me with this platform to share some of my thoughts and insight. And I really appreciate the effort of Right Corridor for coming up with such a crucial discussion and discourse, which is very timely and which is very necessary given the current situation of crisis. So without sparing much of my time, I would like to quickly walk you through basic migration profiles of Nepal, just to have a sense of what sort of labor migration scene are we trying to picture here. So without wasting much time, Nepal is categorized as one of the origin countries for labor migration. It's a small country, a country with around 30 million population. But in all honesty, it's the foreign labor migration that defines the overall socioeconomic landscape of the country. Every day there's around 1,500, 1,500 Nepali youths travel to various destination countries, and by various destination countries, I'm particularly focusing on Gulf and Gulf and Malaysia, because that's where these GCC countries, and Malaysia holds more than 90% of our Nepali migrant workers. So in the pursuit of better income and better employment opportunities, more than 1,500 youths travel to these destination countries every other day. But if I have to give you an exact number of the absentee migrant labor population, I have to beg your ignorance, because that's one problem. We have to start with the problem. That's one problem the country is struggling with, is the debt management. We don't have an exact figure of the absentee foreign labor migrants. But if we take the rough estimation or rough official estimation, then yes, as you mentioned, there are over 5 million migrant workers calculated on the basis of the labor approval provided by the government of Nepal. However, I'd like to draw your attention that this figure does not incorporate the migrant workers who are bound to India for foreign employment, and the undocumented migrant workers. So basically, these are the documented migrant workers who's taken the labor approval from the government and taken the regular channels to furnish their foreign employment.
Mhm.
Yes, we don't have an estimated number of migrant workers engaged in foreign employment in India,
Mhm.
but in all likelihood, although it's difficult to determine because of the open border with India, but in all likelihood, it's certainly one of the most popular destination countries since the
Mhm.
beginning of the ages
Mhm.
for Nepalese. Um, the government of Nepal has opened 110 countries as a labor destination
Mhm.
country,
Mhm.
where top five destination countries for Nepali migrant workers is Malaysia, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
Kuwait. So these are top five destination countries which host more than 90% of Nepali migrant workers.
Mhm.
So if I have to be more precise and give you more specific data on the numbers of migrant workers in these specific countries, uh, I don't have the specific data, but I cannot give you the specific data, but I can give you a rough estimation based on the status
Mhm.
report of the government of Nepal itself. So there are
Mhm.
around
Mhm.
500,000 migrant workers in Malaysia,
Mhm.
more than 400,000 in Qatar, more than 300,000 in Saudi Arabia, while there are more than 200,000 in UAE, while
Mhm.
Kuwait hosts around 70,000 to 80,000 of Nepali migrant workers. So that's the rough estimation of kind of a brief overview of the labor
Mhm.
migration
Mhm.
file. But
Mhm.
if I have to highlight on the skill based and sectoral classification, we everyone here in Nepal is pretty much aware that the kind of work that migrant workers are taking up in Gulf and Malaysia are we usually classify them as the most dirty and the most dangerous work, where
Mhm.
the government estimates that more than 50% of these migrant workers are involved in low skill work.
Mhm.
Uh, so yes, while more than 50% are low skill, there are around
Mhm.
more than 30% which are uh, skilled workers.
Mhm. Mhm.
But
Mhm.
but to give you a glimpse of the sectoral classification, it widely varies from the destination
Mhm.
country.
Mhm.
If I have to give you example, that mostly migrant workers in Qatar are involved in employment
Mhm.
like um, in occupation like
Construction, yeah.
driving
Mhm.
and cleaning, while large
Mhm.
number of workers are in construction,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
majority of them are currently
Mhm.
employed for building the stadium for the upcoming FIFA World Cup.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm. Let me push you a little bit with that point. So the Gulf countries, it's the biggest employer, right, for Nepali workers, and the sectoral segmentation of Nepali workers in precarious, occupations like construction, domestic work, cleaning, have really raised various critical political and diplomatic challenges for the Nepali government. And I wonder, before we get into sort of the current context at the moment, right? I wonder if you could briefly talk about some of the maybe top five issues that migrant workers actually have faced before the COVID. So at least we could compare, right, the worsening effect of it, right, the differences before and now. So maybe five key issues that you've seen, because I know you're a human rights lawyer, you've dealt with a lot of cases at the Supreme Court in Nepal. So maybe five things, and then we could compare them at the moment. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, in all honesty, I have to accept the fact that the situation was not even better before the pandemic, but the pandemic
Mm-hmm.
has kind of aggravated the situation, and it has escalated the severity of the problems faced by migrant workers.
Mm-hmm.
But even before it was as I was trying to come down to their contribution in the overall economy of the nation. Nepal is one of such country which is highly and heavily reliant on the remittances.
Mm-hmm.
The amount sent by the contribution of foreign labor migrants, and the contribution of these remittances shapes the overall narrative of the socioeconomic landscape of the country.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about a little less than 1/3 of national economy is through is a contribution of remittances, and as of the moment, what's really worrying and what's really traumatizing is that since a huge and large number of migrant workers are in the cusp of losing their job, and there's a in all likelihood the remittance amount is going to go down, and since the government did not have any sort of economic backup policies and strategies, it's going to I'm sure that it would have some unwelcoming repercussion on overall socioeconomic impact of the country. It would have a socioeconomic impact and repercussion on the overall being of the country. I have to when it comes to these issues, I really get carried away because this is one thing that we've been raising again and again before the courts and in and outside the court. There's every day, while the international airport bids goodbye to 1,500 Nepali migrant workers, every day the same international airport welcomes the dead body of more than in the average of 3 dead bodies every other day. This is the bracket of exploitation that I'm trying to refer here. There's been a huge crisis looming over the human rights protection, defending their labor rights and stuff. Thousands of migrant workers are languishing behind the bars for in many situations they don't even know what for what reasons they are languishing these jail terms in the absence of effective legal remedies, effective legal assistance. Huge number of migrant workers are behind the bar and there's no one to defend. And similarly, all these problems with migrant workers, it all starts from their own home. They get cheated, misrepresented by their own fellow men, often labeled as the intermediaries of foreign employment. They get misrepresented about the nature of the work. They get misrepresented about the amount of the wages they would be receiving. So they fall in the traps and the vicious interest rate and financial insecurities and unemployment are some of these issues which has been a push factor for foreign labor migration, and combined with these challenges, for example, challenges regarding the deaths of migrant workers, challenges regarding their legal assistance, challenges regarding their violations of human rights, physical and mental tortures. And if we analyze it more from the human rights perspective, then I have to mention about the undocumented migrant workers and domestic workers who are even more vulnerable. There's a different issue of women migrant workers where they have been facing various kind of a sexual and sexual exploitations, followed with physical and mental traumas. So these were the basic. These was the gifts that we've been given to we have given to these migrant workers, and as much as we value the contribution, though, as much as we value and appreciate the amount of remittance in our national economy, we have been equally undervaluing their rights. We have been equally undervaluing their everyday problem and their everyday concerns. So and the situation has been even worsened because of the pandemic, because they are even though they were facing series of these violations, they considering the fact that they would not be able to sustain economically and they have financial securities, they would still face these challenges and still remain in the destination countries. But now they are really vulnerable in the sense that they are financially insecure.
I'll get into this part because I want to make this transition with you, because I know you have a lot to say given the cases that you've been working on actually in Nepal. So what's fascinating, what you're saying is that, pre-COVID, the degree of vulnerability in various sectors, it's such a big problem for the government, for migrants and their families. Sure, it generates a lot of remittances, but the precariousness, right, and the difficulty of the Nepali government to forge bilateral agreements with destination countries, including the Gulf, I mean, really deepens that vulnerability that's already in place, where transnational brokers play a massive role in the migration process, right, of documented but low-skilled, workers, from Nepal. And what's interesting now is, so the market is shifting now, right? So the industries have been disrupted and businesses have been down. States have, reformulating their policies, specifically in the Gulf, where the preference now is given, towards employers in terms of enabling them access different financial or economic relief. Now, in your case, let's look at the current situation, right? So massive vulnerability in the past, but what about now, right? What does this mean now for Nepal, right? Because if you look at the Gulf countries, you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Nepalis here. So you said 400,000 in Qatar, 334,000 in the UAE, and 70,000 in Kuwait. So what does this mean for different categories of Nepali workers? I'm referring to documented, undocumented, skilled, unskilled, single Nepali migrant, and family, migrant worker. Could you give us a sense of what's happening, with these, different migrant sort of populations, and how does the state, specifically the Nepali state, engage and extend various protection mechanisms, if they exist or if they're being extended? So could you tell us more about that dynamics at the moment here, based on the cases that you've seen or you've handled, in Nepal?
All right. Yeah. I'd like to continue what I was saying, because yeah, that's the narrative that we have when we speak about the overall migration governance here in Nepal and the state responses to the plights and concerns of migrant workers. As I was mentioning, that the situation was worsened before pandemic, and now it has aggravated to the severity that migrant workers are double are in more in the risk of double victimization. First by impractical schemes like no pay and no work from destination countries, and followed with forceful eviction and deportations. And and we are not even talking about the virus effect. What's hitting really hard is not the virus. In fact, the factors associated with virus. We're talking about millions of migrant workers who are spread around in these destination countries.
Can you take us specifically in Kuwait, because recently the government has instituted an amnesty policy offering free repatriation tickets for selected type of undocumented migrant workers. And I know you've been writing so proactively on this particular issue. So if you could give us a sense about, what is happening there for Nepali migrant workers, and what's your sense of the current, situations they're facing? Because a lot of them have lost jobs, don't have income, don't have money to pay for their rent, yet the repatriation process and the prolonged lockdowns in Nepal, it's going to happen for a few more weeks. So what does that mean for these workers who are stuck, in the Gulf country?
Yeah. I'm really I really appreciate that you brought this up. Yes, that's exactly what's happening. We can have a sense of what kind of impact the COVID-19 have had on migrant workers. If we talk, if we go beyond Kuwait, then I think the problem is kind of same, or they are more serious. But if we look at the example of Kuwait, I have to say that we have to analyze these from, I think, from the perspective of destination countries, from the perspective country of origin and from the perspective of migrant workers themselves. So if I have to talk about migrant workers, well, since they're helpless, they don't have a job, and followed with the mental traumas, the family disassociation, and when they are wanting more additional guardianship role from the government is not responding in a practical and pragmatic way. There's this situation has really escalated a kind of fear and insecurity among these workers, and since they don't have anything, since they don't have any uh, uh, such issues, all they could do is they would choose to come back to their family, and they would choose to be in their country because there are possible health hazards followed with no employment, no wages. So this is the perspective of migrant workers. But if I have to speak about the perspective of migrant workers, it's a divided opinion between migrant workers themselves. Half of them are willing to be back in their country because since they have nothing left in the destination country, they would rather spend rest of the time with their family and look for other employment opportunities back home. But when the other half of the other half are have a sense of a financial insecurity, and they know the fact that once they are back home, there's no such policies as reintegration from the state, and the skills that they have acquired are not going to be recognized and respected back home. And as the unemployment and poverty related poverty and other social aspect, including the financial debts, the financial traps that they are into, they would rather prefer being in the destination countries than come back home and face all this financial, social stigma. And also the problem is that there has been a growing stigma against migrant workers here in Nepal because they have been stigmatized for bringing these virus in the country, and them being the spreader of the virus. So this kind of social stigma is also impacting workers. And if I have to talk from the country of origins perspective, we can take example of Nepal, where the government has outrightly stated that they are not in the position to return and repatriate such a huge influx of workers.
So this is very interesting. I think let me make just a very quick comparative comment, right? So what you're saying about Nepal is almost quite similar in the case of Filipinos, So in the UAE, for example, when the UAE government facilitated an interstate repatriation process where migrant workers would have to register with their respective embassies. So 44,000 Pakistanis immediately registered, 50,000 plus, from Indian migrant workers. And in the case of Philippines, it's actually less than 1,000 workers. So you can clearly see sort of the intent of who wants to go home and who actually wants to stay. And in the case of Filipinos, especially here, the spread of skill levels, so it's more diverse. So we have people working in various manufacturing, hospitality, nursing industries, domestic work. So you see it's a very diverse market. And what's interesting is that majority of them actually do want to stay. Those who are skilled and have debt, they have no choice but to stay here. So most likely one of the key sort of impacts of post-COVID, once they lose their job, and a lot of them have, is that they will face a lot of these skilling problems, and they will have no choice but to take jobs that, are not the same as their, official occupation in order to survive, But for a lot of the unskilled workers, again, the problem is that the proportion of debt that they've also incurred from the loan sharks. So for example, a lot of domestic workers have incurred a lot, but, especially with their kids, they're in school, different kinds of bills, hospital, investment, et cetera, et cetera. So that really are, pushing them to stay in the country. So if you look at their cost and benefit analysis, the propensity for them to stay in their host country is much higher. And a lot of them would argue that it's better to earn a higher income here in the informal economy than the formal economy back home. And their chances of securing, better COVID treatment is better here than there. So I could see similarities. Yes, Anuj. Yeah.
If I may, I would like to add something.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Um, so, as Anurag said, very rightly pointed out, the cases of Gulf and Malaysia at large. But as you mentioned about Filipinos case, so we have something similar of that sort as well. I mean, the workers in South Korea and Japan, they don't want to come back home because they are secure there, for multiple reasons. I mean, they get better, they're getting better pay, and also the security and other sort of facilities are better compared to other countries. So that is why they do not want to come back. At the same time, those who are in Nepal just before the lockdown or international travel ban, so there is a huge issue that they want to return back to Korea, and then they wanted government of Nepal to facilitate that. And then last week, government has announced that they are facilitating that departure from Nepal to Korea. So that's the case here, but which is exactly opposite to that what we are facing in Gulf and Malaysia. And
That's very interesting.
yeah, earlier I wanted to add something about the post during COVID and pre-COVID. So what was the situation of migrant workers' flight? So so one very interesting observation I've had is, so earlier, pre-pandemic, uh, even if workers wish to come back home, that means Nepal, then there are lots of cases reported to organizations in Nepal, and also in the destination country, that they could not return back to Nepal, like sometimes due to kafala system, sometimes due to various other reasons. But now, as the host country are trying to send them back to their origin country, now the origin country is not accepting them. So you see the contrast. I mean, earlier they wished to come, but they could not. Now they want to come, but they are not being accepted. So the vulnerabilities is similar, but it's quite different. So that is the point I want to raise. Maybe Anurag would add later on about the right to return and stuff like that. So thank you very much.
Okay, Anurag, I'll let you talk now. Yeah, like what do you say to that, Anurag?
Yeah, exactly. As Anuj rightly pointed, there has been issues with kafala and exit permits and other internal rules of these destination countries that was holding migrant workers back. But the thing is, like all these years, we were bashing against destination countries that they are not cooperating, and they are the real culprits behind the violations of the rights, and they don't recognize the rights. But as you can see now, the table has turned. Now they are ready, but they are paying for the ticket fee. They're arranging the flights, and they are happily they happily want to take them back to their country. But what is the response from the country of origin? What is the response from the government here is, well, they are not ready to accept that. I mean, the table has turned, and now the onus, the burden is on the government of Nepal, and the ball is on their feet. And I really want to suggest that if it's not played with the right stroke, then I'm sure that in all likelihood it's the state and it's the government who would bring more from the post effect.
Let me take your comment and Anuj actually into a more regional context in the Gulf region. So what you're saying about this shift of political response in the Gulf countries before it was come, migrate for a lot of reasons. It addresses their shortages. It generates a lot of government revenues in terms of the fees, and it has also created this, transnational brokering industry, right, between recruitment agencies and placement agencies between Asia and Gulf region. Now, the shifts actually with this crisis, right? So I think a fundamental question you need to ask is, how do these Gulf countries view COVID-19? So first, it's again viewed from a public health perspective. High share of migrant populations relative to the local population could constitute, high risks. So I have a paper on this that's going to come out very soon. And, the political calculus in terms of how Gulf countries look at it, depend on these factors, right? The proportion of migrants, in the labor market, and the sectoral, concentration of certain migrants in high risk, right? Positions, also specifically construction, specifically those workers in industrial labor camps. So if you've seen some of the reports here, the Gulf states' domestic priority have, increasingly intensified in terms of addressing public health risks related to the, these migrant industrial labor camps, probably because of the issue of, social distancing, access to certain facilities, and that has become sort of a prime sort of priority for them. So the current approach now is basically to lessen, right, the overall migrant population here through different measures. So in the case of Kuwait, the government, through its humanitarian effort, has decided to finance, right, these repatriation tickets. So it creates a sort of dual function, right? It enables them to achieve that target, which is reduce that migrant population, and at the same time, assist, these migrant workers who are willing to return home. And take note, the difference between past amnesty in Kuwait and now is that workers who are availing amnesty can return back and work legally in Kuwait once COVID is over. I think that's a very important sort of mobility incentive that's being extended to migrant workers, so they could come out and report back. Other Gulf countries are using different measures. So for example, in Saudi, it's between the employer and the Ministry of Labor. So the idea is that if you're employed and you want to go home, you can actually, facilitate that with the Ministry of Labor, and then you can go home. But it doesn't deal with the public health issue. It does in a way that it reduces. So the Saudi government has recently passed a law that stated undocumented workers will be able to access healthcare, right? So it's an indirect form of amnesty for these workers. So it functions in a similar way in the context of Kuwait. And then in the case of UAE, if you've noticed, the government has used two different forms of repatriation schemes. One is the early leave, where I'm mentioning the UAE because it's one of the top destinations for Nepal. And what's interesting in the case of early leave is that documented workers can use their unpaid annual leave and go home and also return back, once COVID is over, while they're trying to contain the spread of COVID-19 in the UAE. And there's also a different measure for visa holders. So I think I've mentioned this, it's between the embassy and the Ministry of Labor. So the point of it is to facilitate repatriation options, right, for these people. So what's interesting is that Gulf countries are attempting, right, to facilitate these repatriation measures with the consent of migrant workers, right? And at the same time, there are also some challenges, because you can't just go home, without settling your, your contract. So for example, if you have unpaid salaries or your gratuity, a lot of workers would fight very hard, to get these. And these are quite essential because you can't just go back home. You have to make sure that your, rights, access to courts, be it physical or virtual, are protected. So in the case of Nepal, I think I want to take you back now to the last point that you talked about, vulnerability. So pre-COVID and the current situation, it appears that the precariousness level has deepened so much that it threatens, the Nepali state's apparatus, to respond, to these issues. So the question for you is, what has been the domestic and foreign policy response of the Nepali government, to handle this migration crisis in the Gulf region? specifically?
Mm,
Anurag,
thank you.
if you could walk us through that.
Right. Yeah. I'll just quickly highlight on I mean, there's nothing I could share in this regard uh, because there aren't any such responses or any such hustles in the domestic level, given the precarity of COVID-19 in the Gulf countries and hundreds of thousands of migrant workers who've already contracted the virus and who's already and hundreds and thousands of others are in the verge of contracting. And the overcrowded accommodations um, and being forced to work amidst irrespective of their physical or mental well-being. So yes, in all honesty, I have to admit the fact that the domestic response has been very ineffective. And has not been very pragmatic. What the government is currently doing is they have been collecting data just so they know that taking updates about the status of migrant workers among in all destination countries. I, I I believe that yes, data is important, and it's a prerequisite for them to prepare for long term and short term response. But while while the citizens are dying and are in a severe risk of health hazard, it's should be the time they would really act, and it should not be the time they spend time around all these documentary and data collection and other stuff, because there has been reported deaths because of the COVID, and not just the COVID. There has been a recorded rate of suicides amongst migrant workers because of the fear of security and no any effective response from their government. Yes, data collection is important, and what the government is doing is what's easy over what is really necessary. If I
Could you
have, Mhm.
could you explain that behavior? Because if you look at other sending countries here, for example, Pakistan has been quite proactive. They facilitated the repatriation sort of options for their workers. Philippines too. They even extended, economic relief to their migrant workers. So you either repatriate them or you ameliorate their current situations in the host country. So it seems to me that the Nepali government has neither done, right? Both options. So I wonder what explains that. Like, what constraints do you see? Because I remember you talked about the dispute in the Supreme Court and the executive branch, where the Supreme Court, as you said, mandated that workers who wish to return must be accepted by the government, right? And the former deputy director of the ILO, Ms. Tetis Mangahas, she commented by saying, origin countries need to reassure that any worker who has lost a job in the Middle East and wishes to return to their home country will be accepted back. That right to return has to be guaranteed and workers assisted to return. If the worker wants to stay in the host country, so be it. So what do you say to that? I mean, to her comment, in terms of looking at that right of the migrant worker, and then at the same time, how Nepal is responding to these, migrant welfare concerns. I mean, what's your comment on that?
Yes, as you rightly pointed out, I agree on what you've just mentioned. That right to return is a basic human rights of the migrant workers, and it has to be respected in all manners. If I have to talk from a human rights lawyer perspective, I have to say that the government has this international obligation to follow and facilitate the return, considering the fact that the country has been a party to international covenant on civil and political rights, and EHR Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where it explicitly mentions about right to return as a fundamental human rights of the citizen of the state. So in that respect, it's the responsibility, and it's the country has to bear this allegiance towards these international instrument, and without wasting any time, who have a consent, who are willing to come back to Nepal, who want to return, they should facilitate, and they should be preparing for all the required resources, structure in facility return. Yes, and this exact sentiment was carried by the recent judgment of Supreme Court. There have been 4 or 5 cases pending before the Supreme Court surrounding the issues of migrant workers and their right to return, where the Supreme Court has explicitly spoken and taken the firm step that it's fundamental human rights of the Nepali migrant workers, and it's the responsibility and accountability of the government to facilitate and to bring them back in their country. But I would like to take you to the recent response from the Ministry of Labor, Employment and Social Security, where the statement mentioned that since the government of Nepal is not in the capacity to entertain these numbers of migrant workers, and since there aren't any infrastructures and there aren't any resources at the moment, so the government basically asks these workers to stay in their destination countries and approach their embassies if they have any sort of issues concerning health or any other issues, labor related affairs. But yes, as you mentioned, you can see the difference in the opinion coming from the judiciary and difference in the opinion coming from the executive of the country. But I have to say that just to take off my human rights lawyer's hat, I can see that it's a very difficult choice for the state itself. Why? Because it's a difficult choice. It's an individual interest versus a national interest. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. At one hand, it's the right of their citizen, and at the other hand, it's the national economy and the overall national state. So if they'll be readily available to facilitate all returns of these huge influx of migrant workers, then this is definitely going to have a severe impact on the overall national economy. So what I can sense is the government is trying to wait and watch until everything settles down, and in the meantime they prepare for the contingent plans, emergency short goals, and also prepare for the integration related skills recognition related long. But what I would really suggest is I mean, the choice looks difficult, but it's an easy option. Had there not been these individuals, then we wouldn't have this national economy. And especially when we're talking about these migrant workers, they have a direct stake in the overall national economy and overall public affairs of the state. In that sense, it's an easy choice. You cannot give a blanket opinion that since these are national issues, we would at least we would at least ignore some of these individual rights. Individual rights, but yes, I have to admit that it's individual interest that leads to the national interest. So the government's contingent plans should be primarily focused on the individual interest, protecting their rights, and the situation is as such that they are in the verge of possible deaths and their health hazard, and we cannot buy national interest sentiments in the exchange of life and liberty of the individual citizen. So yes, I think the government has to be really pragmatic, and the responses have to be really intact, concern covering both the individual interest and national interest. So I mean, I would really suggest the government should not just stay idle, like
Right.
that's what they've been doing, and really come down
Right.
and act.
Let me interject a bit. One of the viewers that we have, I think you know him very well, Barun Gimire. He said that the migrant workers, Nepali, in destination countries have collectively launched a campaign yesterday to pressure government to ensure the right to return. So which is very similar to Ms. Satisma's point. So the generic assumption that migrants do not want to come back home in Nepal may not be entirely true. What do you say to that?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, even if not for the government, the networks of the lawyers have been very have really played a very effective and dynamic role in this situation. And even if the government does not have an official data, these labor migrant networks have been collecting data, and they've been out there in the field, providing access to providing access to the accommodation. And they're the one who's like actually helping in the situation where migrant workers were supposed to be protected and their welfare should be guaranteed through the government. So yeah, it looks that because of this these campaigns of the campaigns like it's our right to come to the country, and irrespective of whatever ramifications the migrant worker had to face, and in this current crisis, they really wish to be in their country. They really wish to be in the comfort of family. But as I was going through other surveys where I was informed, I got the sense that it does not represent the sentiment of all migrant workers. Half of these migrant workers are also willing to stay in
the country. So let me explain a little bit, like, how do Gulf countries, potentially view, a sending country like Nepal. So some Gulf countries, for example, in the case of Kuwait, what they would potentially assume would be, we're financing the whole thing. We're removing a lot of these procedures, so your nationals, right, especially those undocumented ones, would be able to go home, specifically those people who wish to return, right? But yet you have a country like Nepal. I understand the domestic constraints that you've mentioned, resources, quarantine areas, you name it. Now, what they're saying is that if we are ready to facilitate this, we have paid flights, we put your nationals in different shelters in preparation for their repatriation. Yet your airports, due to the prolonged lockdown, are still closed, right?
Yes.
How does that affect sort of Nepal's image, in the Middle East region, right, where it's the biggest employer, and I guess my question is that in terms of framing it as a shared obligation between states, how do you think Nepal, how do you think it's viewed actually in that context, right? Like, because here it doesn't look good at the moment, right? Even within the Gulf countries, there are different approaches. So I'd say Kuwait has the most generous, right, policy offer at the moment relative to the other Gulf countries. But yeah, you have Nepal. Now, I would also argue that the state, how it balances its interests, as you said, the national interest. You have 25 million population, who are also potentially, might be facing public health risk, from the 5 million outside. So the state has to cautiously, plan and identify strategies, But I think the question that I have is that, given the 5 billion welfare fund that you have there, right? Do you think that's a sufficient excuse for the Nepali government? Sufficient reasoning to not expedite the repatriation process, and relative to other sending countries that have already facilitated the repatriation of their nationals? What do you say to that?
Um, I'm not sure about what's the government's take on this. They might
Mhm,
have been
mhm, mhm,
having discussion in an in internal manner, but since we're not we don't have an access to what kind of discussion they are into, so all we could do
mhm,
is we could just speculate and make our own assessment based on what's going on around,
mhm,
right? So what I really
mhm,
feel
mhm,
is, I don't think budget or infrastructure would be the issue for not bringing back the migrant workers who
mhm,
are
mhm,
willing to come back. I also like to take you back to the same issue where the
mhm,
state is really concerned about is the national economy
mhm,
and and I mean the state, it's not that the state hasn't done anything to before pandemic situation. It's not that the state hasn't have any
mhm,
such initiative launched on the welfare and protection of migrant workers. They've been doing their best, I would say, but still, the state is not in the position to reintegrate these big influx of returning migrant workers. What kind of a practical scenario I can see, uh,
mhm,
this kind of relates to our post-pandemic question. If
mhm,
we are to anticipate the mass influx of returning migrant workers, uh, then there's a clear issue that
mhm,
the government should come up with strong reintegration policies, both in terms of social
mhm, mhm,
reintegration and in terms of economic reintegration. You know, they
mhm,
have to
mhm,
have a specific schemes on recognizing the skills of these migrant workers. And
mhm, mhm,
in my knowledge, I'm pretty aware that migrant workers we've been involved in these low skilled jobs. They would
mhm,
not be available. They would not be ready for resuming the same occupation back here,
mhm, mhm,
for basically
mhm,
for first the social stigma. They would not. I mean, even if the common narrative is that even if you are involved in low skilled works abroad, you still have some kind of a respect in the society. If I'm talking
mhm,
about the rural, if it's the narrative of rural Nepal, which hosts a large number of migrant workers.
mhm, mhm,
So in all capacity, they would not be able to resuming the
mhm,
job, even though their skills get
mhm,
recognized. And the remittance had such an impact on our overall social and economic facet that
mhm, mhm,
we don't have any sort of a backup plan if not for
mhm,
remittances. You know what I'm trying to
mhm,
say?
mhm.
There's this term called Dutch disease effect. Are you aware of
Mhm,
this?
mhm, mhm. Right.
Yes, in
Mhm,
economics they have this
mhm,
word Dutch disease effect. The Dutch disease effect is so severe in our country that the remittances has dried up all other sources
mhm, mhm,
of
mhm,
economy. The
mhm, mhm,
agriculture has gone down, the manufacturing has gone down, and all we are relying is heavily on the remittances. And
mhm, mhm,
we are thinking of a situation where there is a massive downflow of remittances, or in certain situation we are also thinking of no
mhm,
remittances. And so we are thinking of a situation where the country is
mhm,
going to get
mhm,
devastated,
mhm,
economically.
mhm, mhm,
And it also have a social ramification. For
mhm,
example, there
mhm,
was a
mhm.
it's going to severely impact the
Mhm,
poverty rate. It's going to severely impact the unemployment rate, and it's going to
mhm,
severely impact uh, our access to food, our food security,
mhm, mhm, mhm,
and it's
mhm.
also going to impact the businesses that has been
Right, right.
that has grown up and that has escalated with
Mhm,
with with the coming of the remittances.
mhm,
I'm talking
mhm.
about
You
related
let,
banks.
let, let me take you to the. I think you talked about the contributions of migrants, right? So much. So before, with the high proportion of Nepalis outside, I mean, they were seen as assets, right? Because they contribute back to the country. Now, all of a sudden, in a crisis context, they've turned into liabilities, right? Challenges for the state, and to an extent, it raises a lot of political and legitimacy crisis. to the Nepali state whether they can extend, protection or not. And I think an interesting question there is, or did Nepal, or has Nepal basically carefully studied these host countries' regulations, approaches, and policies? So, for example, let me go specifically in the context of testing, right? So, in the Gulf countries, the question is that do these Gulf countries facilitate, pre-boarding, on-site COVID-19 testing before these workers return, right? So that's an interesting question, because I think that's one of the critical fears of a sending country like Nepal. I think partly that could explain why they're resisting to immediately open the market. So, for example, in the case of Ethiopia and Saudi, there were criticisms, against the Saudis when, according to one official, an international organization official, what they said is that Saudi, quote, deported Ethiopian migrant workers without conducting that test, and that really, raised a lot of public health risks, and concerns to the to the Ethiopian state. Now, it's the same thing. It's the same case for the Indian case. Actually, they're also afraid that the mass repatriation of these workers could, to an extent, infect a lot of these populations, specifically in places like Kerala, right? So, if you rank and look at Gulf countries, for example, UAE conducts that pre-COVID on-site test, prior to their departure. Kuwait, based on the reports that I've seen, they don't, and that's half and half according to some of the reports that I've seen. So that could be a potential sort of argument for Nepal to not immediately or to cautiously approach it, right? But I think Ms. Tekis, again, I think she came back with a question. I think your question is that, are the host country governments ready to assure that returning workers have tested negative from COVID? That's actually mixed, right? There's no unified or collective decisions from the Gulf states to do that. So in the case of Nepal, I'm trying to read Nepal from a Gulf country perspective. This is exactly what I'm trying to do, so I can meet you halfway. So you have these constraints, and are these fears, as you said, right? Are these fears legitimate, right? What can the Nepali government practically do now to ameliorate, right, these tensions? Because, as you know, Gulf countries with low-skilled sectors have been shut down at the moment. Construction, hospitality, cleaning, you name it, right? It's either they're fully displaced or partially displaced. Now, these markets, it's been, they are in a precarious situation, no salary, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of them wouldn't be able to survive this month to pay for the rent, you see. They have money, some money for food, but not for rent. So what is the what's the Nepali government doing in terms of ameliorating this or defining, what's the contingency strategy at the moment? It sounds to me that there is no contingency strategy at the moment. Is that a fair statement, or what's going on there?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with your point that we don't have a contingency plans, but yes, as the official statements have been reiterating the fact that they are really on it, and they're trying to think it through both from short-term perspective and long-term perspective in terms of bringing back these migrant workers. So I mean, well, the government would I believe the government would come up with the set of plans and schemes, but at the moment, what I really feel is that they should set aside the long-term goals and really act on their emergency and contingent plans. For example, it could be guaranteeing the access to food for these migrant workers in the Gulf, who have had serious issues with access to food. Seriously. It's not just the food, and it's also the accommodation and large number of migrant workers are reported to have not have any amount left to pay for their rent, and they're literally on the streets, sleeping on the streets. So this kind of situation, in this kind of situation, I don't think the government would just turn a blind eye to this kind of situation. So first thing first would be food, the basics. That it should be basics. That would be the food. That would be the accommodation, and most importantly, the government to really make an assessment if has there been a guaranteeing of their right to health. Have they been able to access the medical and the health facilities in timely, orderly manner? If not, then I think the primary focus should be on the health and medical
aspect of it.
while
Right,
countries.
because that is sort of the biggest concern, right? I mean, that's the reason why you have this repatriation measures here to reduce this public health risks. Now, the question, as you said, is, how do you make sure that this public health risk is not being transferred back, to a sending country like Nepal? Because that could really create disastrous public health, crisis in your country if the government fails to cautiously deal with it. But as you said, as you rightly pointed out, like, how do you balance sort of, the long-term and the short-term needs of these workers? As you said, it's food and rent, but those things cost a lot here, a lot of money, right? And high number of migrants could also, mean high costs for the government, right? And that can be very difficult. I mean, at the moment, Philippines is extending economic relief, and your non-state actors, I think some of the NGOs, Nepali NGOs, are providing all these, in-kind economic, in-kind support at the moment. But those things are still not enough, because what they need is actually accommodation to survive for this month, for the next month, and hopefully for the other month. So Anuj, I remember you've written some op-ed articles about this. What's your take on Anurag's, perspective regarding the state's response, towards Nepali migrants in the Gulf, specifically Kuwait?
I mean, so Anurag rightly, stated what Nepal's position is at the moment. I mean, so to my knowledge, I mean, Nepal government has not been reactive. Let's forget about being proactive. So not even reactive. So in the beginning, as you said, probably Anurag said that we are looking, or we're opting for the easier option rather than the necessary option. So easier option meaning, so every now and then Prime Minister of Nepal, or also the Minister of Labor and Employment, so they have conversation with their counterparts in the destination country, requesting them, or if I may, begging them to keep Nepali there intact. So I mean, as you mentioned about the fund, welfare fund, I mean, there are lots of talk that Nepal could potentially use the welfare fund money to actually, take care of this crisis. And then the fund is around $50 million, and that's a huge money. And then we have a money, but we don't have the mechanism, actual planning how to use that. And then what if this crisis prolongs and then the money wears out, and then there are lots of other challenges to take care of with that money, meaning giving compensation to the migrant workers, and then so on and so forth. There are lots of other areas. So maybe government is reluctant to use that money immediately. They're just trying to request and buy some time.
Why is that? I think some rights groups might claim that's completely unacceptable, right? If you calculate what migrants have contributed to the country versus the short-term assistance that they are requiring at the moment. Why do you think that is?
I mean, so from my opinion, they're just buying some time. I mean, but
Anurag, Anurag, what do you think of that? I mean, you're a human rights lawyer. I mean, you've handled a lot of cases that you could see the severity of this and the impact on migrant workers. Buying time, right? So what do you think that is,
I really don't like to answer this question, but I have to, I really have to play the role of a bad cop here.
So just give me a second. Just to give you more data. I
Okay.
mean, government
Sure,
has
sure,
not
sure, Anuj. Yeah.
government with the recent BBC article, the government of Nepal, they are expecting to repatriate few migrant workers
Mhm.
only after a month and a half from now, meaning mid-June.
Okay.
So they are preparing for
Thank
that.
you.
So that's a long time. Um,
Mhm.
Almost 45 days, 45, 50 days. So
Mhm.
so for me, they are clearly buying some time. I mean,
Mhm.
relying on others.
Mhm.
As
Mhm.
Anurag said, the onus has to be on government Nepal, but it is not the case. So yeah, just
Mhm.
to give you
Mhm.
more data.
Mhm.
So yeah, Anurag, all yours.
Just before you respond to that, Anurag, so what the Philippine government is doing, for example, in Kuwait, is to shift the pressure to recruitment agencies, right? Recruitment agencies who are still responsible, over the welfare of their migrant workers. But in the context of undocumented workers, in this case, 7,000 Nepali workers, that's a
Mm,
pretty big number, right? And that would be a big challenge for the labor or welfare attaché to exert, administrative pressure or financial pressure to these agencies because of the legal status of these migrant workers. Now, in the case of, the Nepali state buying some time, so if the timeline is 45 days, that's almost 2 months of rent, right? Workers don't have savings, right? So in the here, I would say if you live in a bed space, so bed space, it's basically bed space, like some of the smaller, beds where 8, 9, 10 people live, very crowded. That's almost $200, right? So assuming you have 7,000 undocumented workers times $200, that's a lot of money, right? And a lot of workers won't be able to afford that. So buying time, right? And you have this fund, right? What do you think is the best approach, right, in terms of handling this? Because I think one of our audience here too, I think her name is Nehad Chudari. She says, what the government in Nepal is doing is negotiating a bilateral sort of discussions with destination countries, making pre-departure tests for COVID a priority, right? That's what they're trying to do, I think, in theory and in practice as well. So what's the best approach, Anurag, given sort of and Anuj, given the complexity of this issue, be it testing, be it the welfare of the workers, the timeline, and the fund, that's actually there, yet it's not moving, right? The Philippines did move it, right? In limited terms, right? It's still, because they're like Nepal, they're slowly watching it. And the Philippines doesn't have an official contingency plan as well, right? So let me just highlight that. But I wanted to know from both of your perspectives, right? What do you think would be an interesting or important or critical approach in the short run?
I think it's the right time the government should play the bilateral cooperation card here, uh, because I think it's time. I mean, it's time, and it's high time that these issues are not just the issue of one destination country or one country of origin.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
These bilateral agreements that we have agreed, we have signed with these various destination countries should come into effect, and we need to really play on that. I coming from a human rights background, I really think that the rights and rights of these migrant workers should be the
mm-hmm,
stepping stone. But bearing in mind that we are talking about uh, the economically, what we are bargaining against, whom we are bargaining against, is
mm-hmm,
economically giant countries like
mm-hmm,
GCC and Malaysia. you know
mm-hmm,
I think we should be really playing our bargaining chip here. And I would like to bring your attention to what government of Nepal, uh, uh, in the negotiation phase with Malaysia and the government of Nepal, where the government really stood up and had firmly
mm-hmm,
stood up in
mm-hmm,
bringing all these rights and welfares of migrant
mm-hmm,
workers in
mm-hmm,
the bilateral agreements. you know uh,
mm-hmm,
these agreements, I mean, I think that it's really the time that you should actually
mm-hmm,
check what kind of
right.
what kind of a rights that we're talking about, what kind of a bilateral
Right.
cooperation
Mhm,
that's
mhm,
that are in these sorry uh, bilateral agreements. And if I
mhm,
have
mhm,
example, the recent bilateral agreement of Nepal has been very welcoming in
mhm.
terms of addressing the rights of migrant workers and
But
establishing the monitoring obligation both on the
mhm.
country of origin and country of destination. I'm talking
The-
about
the-
the bilateral agreement with Malaysia, the bilateral agreement with UAE, the bilateral agreement with Mauritius, and the bilateral
mhm, mhm.
agreement with Jordan. It's really practical, and they have established a task force, having representatives of both country of origin and country of
Mhm, mhm.
destinations. It's time we actually we should actually question what are these task force doing at this moment
Mhm,
when
mhm,
really be activating and really be playing an
mhm,
efficient
mhm.
role.
But
So
but mind you, I mean, sending countries like Nepal have faced difficulties in terms of exerting their demands. Specifically in the Gulf countries, the power asymmetry is extremely embedded, right, in the migration governance in the Gulf. Now, if you struggle to exert your diplomatic power in the past, what makes you think, right, that you'll have the capacity to negotiate more effectively this time, given that the cost of testing is very expensive, one, and two, their economies as well have been fully shut down or partially shut down. So I think the bottom line question is that, how can Nepal, a small state with very low fiscal budget, right? And how can it, negotiate and deal with the Gulf countries? I think Malaysia might be a great example, but the contexts are very different now. In these agreements that you've mentioned, these were formed in a non-crisis context, but this is a crisis context where the funds are low, politics are too deep, and the state responses must be measured, right? Must be um, extremely sharp to a point where they would optimally achieve their objectives, and shift, whatever responsibilities to the other party, because that is the shared nature of migration governance. Anuj, what would you say to Anurag? Because what Anurag is saying, these mechanisms have worked to an extent in the case of Nepal, but do you think they would really work at this point in time? Because now Gulf countries have to deal with so many sending countries. So we have a response from Jessie Merton, and she says, in Sri Lanka, we're hearing the government, ask the same question regarding prior testing. Here, they don't seem to feel they will have much success. Do you see that degree of um, um, concern that they have? So given that it's on every origin country's agenda, I wonder what governments are doing or can be doing collectively, right? So can sending countries to an extent collectively, exert their pressure? I mean, that is another interesting question. But, I want to go back to the Nepal case because I think it's a very, very important one. So I'll let you respond to Anurag, Anuj, and then Anurag, you respond to both of us and you can counter us. Yeah. Yes, Anuj.
Yeah. So to answer your question and just to respond, Anurag, I mean, Nepal is in
Mhm,
even more, serious uh, powerless status,
mhm,
because
mhm, mhm,
earlier it was like, we, except for
mhm,
sending
mhm,
people to work there, we do not have any
mhm,
sort of trade relation or any other thing
mhm,
that we'd actually
mhm, mhm,
bargain on, right?
mhm, mhm,
But
mhm,
now, uh, and then given that situation, we, managed to broker some bilateral agreement. I mean, that's there, but now we are not in position
mhm,
to actually demand,
mhm,
because if Nepal stands alone, and then there is no
mhm,
chance. There is
mhm,
no
mhm,
chance. In
mhm,
fact, I'd not be surprised in future.
mhm,
Maybe this
mhm,
crisis
mhm,
ends pretty soon, and in
mhm,
future,
mhm,
if something happens, then Nepal would not have any chance to bargain actually with the
I see.
destination country. The
I
bargaining
see.
power is really
Mhm,
low at the moment.
mhm, mhm, mhm,
But as you mentioned, if there is a collective effort from the sending countries,
mhm,
then maybe we can have some kind of
mhm, mhm,
negotiation. But yeah, go ahead.
mhm. So we'll keep the responses very shorter now because I think we're running out of time. It's almost an hour and a half. The discussion is so fascinating that we need to respond faster. So some of our viewers are saying that they're doubtful, right, that interstate cooperation, between sending countries is feasible. So Tetis Mangahas actually noted that, and some of our viewers also said that um, that it may be a great time for sending countries like Nepal to use regional consultative dialogue mechanisms such as the Colombo process, right, or the SARC, to hold dialogue with countries of destinations collectively. Because
Yes.
if a small state like Nepal cannot exert itself, right, at the regional level, then perhaps being a member of these regional consultative dialogues, right, might be an interesting mechanism to initiate that process. But the question is that what is or what are what are they doing basically, right?
Mm.
Uh, has these dialogues been initiated already? Um, as you know, a lot of migrant workers are facing a lot of critical challenges at the moment. That's the nature of the market: massive unemployment. States have low budgets, and some of them have not mobilized their fiscal budgets or welfare funds. Such as in the case of Nepal. So what do you think of that mechanism, Anurag? Just very briefly, do you think that would work? And what do you say to that in the context of Nepal?
That's exactly where I was trying to come to.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Uh, I mean, by the sense of bargaining power, I was trying to more relate to the bilateral cooperation thing.
Mm-hmm.
More sort of a cooperation and negotiation on how do we handle this, uh, because I mean, it would really take a long time for all this region, for taking it to regional level and establishing a cohort of countries of origin. But the advantage that we have is, yes, we already have regional platforms like Colombo process and SARC
Mm-hmm.
initiatives in
Mm-hmm.
so we can make most out of our regional platforms
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to have our to have our negotiation have
Mm-hmm.
a more weight. But
Mm-hmm.
yes, but the thing is, like, as eagerly as we want to respond to this situation, and as eagerly we want to talk with these and bring, I mean, uh, but give a sense of a security to our migrant workers, equally eagerly the country of destination want to get rid of our migrant workers. It's not just the COVID. What's the hustle before COVID has been something like the Gulf coming up with nationalization policies, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to get rid of the migrant workers, and similarly followed with the oil crisis in the Middle East, and the prices going
Mm-hmm.
down and hitting the rock bottom, you know
Right.
and
Mm-hmm.
also, yeah, also followed with these kind of situations where we can take example of Qatar and Kuwait, where Qatar forcefully evicted and deported hundreds of
Mm-hmm.
migrant workers, taking advantage of the situation, and taking advantage
Mm-hmm.
of this situation, they really want to get rid of the undocumented migrant workers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
as as
Mm-hmm.
as we're showing eagerness to have some kind of a contingent or long-term plan,
Mm-hmm.
the sense that we can have from destination countries, they really would want to get rid of the migrant workers. I think we can
Mm-hmm.
play around between the commonalities between what would be the best for our people. That's
Right.
how I
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
do more
Mm-hmm.
of the bilateral cooperation thing. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it should focus and
Mm-hmm.
surround around the issues, rights of
Mm-hmm.
workers.
Mm-hmm. So, so in a nutshell, I mean, a lot of these sending states, as you both mentioned, they're independently trying to forge relationships and negotiations with the Gulf countries. And again, I do agree with our viewers that the regional consultative dialogues, the Colombo process, the SARC, should directly negotiate with their counterparts here in the Middle East region immediately, because workers are struggling, and sending states do not have the exact data. I feel they're struggling to even get that data. That's why there's no pressure for them to act accordingly, given the crisis that you see here. So data matters a lot, and as you pointed out, I mean, the accessibility and the transparency of these data, it could really impact the way states, would behave. And in this case, it appears that the Nepali state is struggling to even have, such data. Now, I know we're running out of a lot of our time, so I think let me just very briefly go to the very, two minor components of the last section. One is, how do you see a post-COVID Nepal, right, in the context of Asia Gulf migration corridor? And to be more specific, let me inject one of our colleagues' questions, actually. Mr. Rick Casco from the IOM in the Philippines, he basically asked, how much impact do you forecast COVID-19 will have on employment and remittances, right, in Nepal? So how do you see these different sectors, right, shifting in the long run? Because Gulf countries, it may take time for the markets to bounce back, right? It may take a year or two or even more. So that will change, plus the existing intra-competition, right, even from within, because some of the other migrants, like Arab migrant workers, African migrant workers, will also stay and compete, right, for these jobs. Now, how do you see Nepal, playing a role in terms of, carving that niche, right, that they've tried and they've succeeded in some ways, but with the post-COVID, right, the jobs are low, and you have this massive competition at play. So how do you view or visualize a Nepal in a post-COVID world?
Yeah, I think I've already mentioned about what kind of social and financial repercussions and ramifications the country should brace for. I really think that the current problem of COVID and the current pandemic, it's just a tip of an iceberg. What's forthcoming more devastating, and it's more unwelcoming. I'm talking about the social impact that the aftermath of COVID-19 would have, the economic impact, the aftermath of COVID impact will have. As I mentioned before, and I also like to inform again that yes, remittance has been a backbone, but yes, again, the dust disease effect. It has all other sources, and we don't have a backup economic plan. We don't have backup economic policies and strategies, and our national plan, our plans are not aligned in such a way that we are in the position to seek an alternative to remittances at the present moment. What we can anticipate is it is going to have a severe impact on the national economy of the nation. The World Bank is estimating around 15 to 20% of downfall in remittances, but what I can sense is the Gulf countries and are taking advantage of COVID-19, and they are really trying to get rid of larger number of migrant workers, which means that the remittance amount is likely to go down way higher than what Bank is estimating. The same reasons, the political reasons in Gulf. Sorry.
But Gulf countries may argue, let me just play the devil's advocate here. They may also argue that they also have to protect their industries. They have to protect the local populations. They have to protect the legal, right, migrant populations that are still working in the region. So it's an initial public health strategy that they're doing in order to secure the safety, right, of their countries. Now, some rights groups might say, well, what about their social protection, right? You can't just repatriate these migrant workers without legally addressing some of their social protection concerns and also the public health in the context of sending countries where they have to make sure that these are healthy, tested, right, workers prior to returning to their countries of origin. So there's also an argument to be made from the Gulf countries, with such, perspective. So I think a really key, challenge there is that, their ability to negotiate bilaterally, right? Which we all question here, whether they do have the capacity, on an individual scale or collectively, right? Using these regional consultative dialogues. Now, what you're saying here is that it looks like a very precarious world, right? For Nepal, the post-COVID, right? And it takes time. Imagine Nepal has worked so hard in terms of building these industries, training a lot of workers, and all of a sudden they go back to where they started, right? It just takes time. And it has this ripple cyclical effect to the country, the migrants and their families, the industries locally. And responding to what Anurag said, Anuj, how do you view a post-COVID world, for Nepal? Just very briefly, so at least before we get into the recommendations,
Well, as I said, I mean, the Nepal would be more vulnerable going forward if the situation continues. But as you said earlier, I mean, it is not only about Nepal, but towards all sending countries that the destination country have to worry because they've also invested in the workers. I mean, they don't want to lose out. I mean, just like that. So that could be one of the negotiation point that sending countries can put because you're also losing out. It is not just us kind of thing, but in terms of Nepal, I mean, we're just relying on the destination countries' goodwill to support, and that does not happen in international relations. From international relations point of view, I mean, there is nothing. I mean, the goodwill thing doesn't work always. I mean, this is all hardcore realist world. So that's what I'd like to believe. So we have to have some backup, be it from regional or collective effort or some other kind of thing, meaning increasing the trade relation stuffs like that. Then only Nepal would be a bit Nepal would be in a secure position. Otherwise, I don't see any bright future going forward.
Well, that's pretty unanimous sort of response, from all of us. I mean, and given that the variables that we're seeing are leading us to conclude that, what do you think are some of the short-term responses or recommendations that you see would be vital for the Nepali government, right, within the next few months? I'll start with you, Anurag. I'll let you outline them because I know you've written them. So share them with us. What do you think?
Yeah, before I move on to recommendation, I would just like to
Sure.
what Anuj was mentioning before. The bargaining chip. I really like this word. You remember we had this conversation back in Leiden about how these chips can be used against destination countries. Exactly as Anuj said, we can take example of what Nepal government did with Malaysia. The corridor was halted for more than 6 months, and eventually the Malaysian government had to step down and accept accept most of the recommendations of government Nepal to have all these labor and human rights related issues be jotted down on the labor agreement between Malaysia and Nepal, and which actually happened. So it's both. This is how we are to use this negotiation and bilateral agreement and bilateral cooperation thing with destination countries. And when I'm also just few facts on what's post COVID Nepal's likeliness in terms of social and financial ramification. I could see that since Nepal does not have this strong reintegration plans, no strong mutual skill recognition schemes, in all likelihood, it would be very difficult for the government to retain these migrant workers for a longer period of time, and which we have been witnessing in past 2 decades. There are cases of remigration where migrant worker would come back with bigger plans, but with the and the kind of the income that he or she will be yielding from domestic level would be too low if you compare it with what they were drawing as a salary in Gulf with the same skill. So in all likelihood, they are to remigrate, and there are chances they will be trading all their money, the same, and they will be trading. They will be happily and readily available to be back on the debt trap and remigrate. And in that and taking advantage of that situation where we're sensing some kind of a rise in the rate of crimes in relation to migration. For example, I'm sure there'll be an escalation in human smuggling related crime. There'll be escalation in the crimes of human trafficking, and these agents and intermediaries are more likely to get activated, taking advantage of this situation. So yes, and on social fronts, yes, this is going to have a knock-on effect on all assets, be it on employment, be it, the government is planning for 8-point-something% of economic growth in the coming year, which is less likely with the downfall and in the remittances amount, and also the current pandemic has a role to play in that. But still, it's not just the economic aspect that I'm trying to relate, but all facets, social facet as well. For example, it's going to have a knock-on effect on the overall literacy rate. I can sense that because that's how remittance has its roots spread over in all these social and economic economic landscape of this country. So I'm seriously witnessing a kind of anticipating a disaster in terms of that. So it's really the time. It's really the high time the government play with the right card and play with the right strategy. If not for now, then I'm sure this is just a tip of an iceberg. The of what we are kind of impact is paramount, and it's counted. So, the possible recommendation would be come up with contingent and emergency plans. What's and just don't sit there. Really act. For example, provide the basic utilities. Those who are willing to return. Just facilitate their safe return. At least recognize the right to return as their fundamental right, or at least recognize migrant workers as the rightful shareholders of this nation, right holders of this nation. So yes, health facilities, food facilities, accommodation, and in the meantime, infrastructural development and resources, for example, building resources on quarantine and self-isolations for the immediate rescue and repatriation of the migrant workers, social counseling for overcoming the fear of social stigma and
we don't have a lot of time. Sorry, you have to wrap it up. Sorry, this is so much. I know.
Right.
I'll give you 1 more minute to expand on your recommendations. 1 more minute. Give us the 1 minute. Yeah.
I'm done. So
Okay.
also some midterm strategies in terms of disaster preparedness, also emergency budgets for the future references, and following the set of recommendations from international organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, ILO, IOM. They have a lot of recommendation for employers, country of destinations, migrant workers themselves. So basically focusing on what basically working out on this set of recommendation, and in the long term prepare for the reintegration, have an alternative for the reliance over remittances. I mean, generating large scale employment and more enacting social and integration related measures, schemes, and policies.
And Anuj, any final word, recommendations, complementing what Anurag has mentioned?
So exactly agreeing whatever Anurag said, I'd just like to add, what Nepal government could immediately do is to engage the migrant workers, community in the destination country. I mean, they just have to engage them and then just try to capacitate them with, little bit more funding if possible, and then so that they feel secure. I mean, just that's the immediate thing that they can do, Nepal government can do to engage the migrant community in the destination country. Second, not as a first that and second this. Second, meaning, I mean, in parallel, Nepal government has to work to repatriate those who are willing to come back. I mean, make proper facilities, and as Anurag said, not just plan but take actions. So that those two would be my recommendations.
So I think these are fantastic recommendations, and I'll just add a very quick note for the concluding part of our dialogue, that Nepal has to really consider these complex realities, right, and react, within the boundaries of these realities. So, for example, first off, they have to really negotiate, harder, with destination countries to ensure that testing mechanisms are being conducted, right? To make sure that all these workers who choose to return home will be tested, right? So I think that will alleviate some of the cost pressure and some of the public health risks, right? That could, spread in Nepal. And the second thing is not just individually, like bilaterally, but also on a regional level with other sending countries using these regional consultative dialogues. I think that's a very, very important point to highlight, given the power asymmetry in place. The second is that they also have to recognize the importance of data and differentiate those who wish to return and those who wish to stay. Those who wish to stay, who are legal, right, and who are still working and have the capacity to extend their time in these different sectors, I think those people should be, to an extent, protected and given some form of assistance, similar to what other sending countries are doing, be it short-term financial assistance. Now, for those who are choosing to return, I think the government has to be very, very direct and be very clear in terms of the expectations, in terms of what the government can do and cannot do, because I think the precarious positions of undocumented workers, it's a big challenge for the state. I mean, we're at least quite lucky that Kuwait is extending that benefit. Other Gulf countries are not doing that. So I think Nepal has to really, carefully develop their approaches, in different corridors. So in this case, the most generous one is Kuwait. I think it has to respond, towards facilitating. So at least that would reduce, the pressure that you see for them. And again, balancing these challenges between protecting the public health concern of the local populations in Nepal versus those in abroad, I mean, that's a very big one. And perhaps that might be a reason, why the Nepali state has to strategically calculate these, that buying time could be a factor or could be a consequence, of that dilemma that they're facing. But others, as you said, Anurag, they still have that fun, they still have that responsibility, right? So how do we actually balance these? And I think it's I don't have an answer. Most people won't have an answer. And sending countries are also looking for answers, like such as Bangladesh, right? They also have higher proportion of migrant workers. And it's a big challenge, and I think the function of, or the purpose of this dialogue is to tease out the different dimensions, of this issue of migration governance, for Nepal in the Gulf. And we do hope that we'll come up with a 1-2-page paper, so at least we can summarize all these points and share it to our audience and to the international community. And I do thank you so much, Anurag, for your insights and recommendations. Anuj, thank you very much for helping us to coordinate and co-facilitate this. And before I end it, I'll give you a minute, Anurag, for final thoughts, a minute for Anuj, and then we'll close it.
Well, I'm kind of drained out of my opinion, but all I can say is thank you for initiating this dialogue. And I hope to see more of these kind of discourse and discussion, because no one was prepared for this situation. More and more of these kind of talks and more of this kind of discourse would definitely take us somewhere. So thank you for all this, and for the government, please do act. It's time.
And Anuj, okay, Anuj, what are your last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so thank you very much for organizing this. And so I mean, I don't know how to explain that these kind of dialogues are supporting policymakers if they are listening. Also, we have to make them listen, because these are very crucial. I mean, as Anurag said, this is not normal time. This is something different, and we have to act different. We cannot actually rely on the traditional stuffs to take care or to address this unprecedented situation. So yeah, and thank you very much for all your effort, and the inputs from insights of Anurag are very important. So let's do this off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, thank you to both of you. Thank you to our viewers. Fantastic comments from Jesse Mertens, Neda Chodari, Padam Singh Tapa, Mr. Tetis Manahas, Mr. Rick Casco, Mr. Barun Dimire, Santosh Hadikari, Nea Chodari again, and all the viewers who've taken the time to respond to us. So we do hope that we've contributed some insights to all of you. And we will be unpacking how other sending countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Vietnam are also responding. So we'll have more of these dialogues in the coming weeks. And we do hope you follow and subscribe to Rights Corridor. And thank you so much. Anuj, Anurag, thank you very much. And we do believe that what you said, what you contributed here, will be written down, will be shared to senior officials for the purpose of ensuring the protection, right, for the rights of migrant workers in the Gulf and beyond. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
The Anurag, it's alive.